Well, Vilna was the world, in a way, in its time. No, I mean, Vilna was self-sufficient. Jews of Vilna were self-sufficient. And those who shrunk Vilna into Jewish Vilna, as they did in the 1930s, were, from a historical point of view, doing something very dangerous, because they did not have the powers of self-defense. So to shrink yourself into a self-sustaining world which cannot defend itself is a very, very dangerous thing to do. But culturally, they did feel self-sufficient. So he didn't think of traveling anywhere. I mean, it's not that he would have thought of picking up and going to Paris or going to, you know, and he certainly did not think of picking up and going to the Soviet Union, which is where some of them did pick up. Yeah. Moshe Kulbach in the 1920s, who was a real Vilna poet, the most famous Vilna poet of the day, had gone over illegally, made the crossing into the Soviet Union. So that was where most of young Vilna went. If they were going anywhere, they would go to the Soviet Union. Of course, that would never have occurred to Sutskver. He was the farthest thing from a political, ideological leftist. But I don't think he would have thought of going anywhere. But yes, the logic of going to Eretz Yisrael was for him, of course. He got Golda Meir to intervene in order to get him the possibility of coming to Eretz Yisrael. There's no way that he would have come to America. There's no way that he would have come anywhere else. I think he felt powerfully. I mean, Yiddish, after all, was the embodiment of Jewishness. Yiddish, the word Yiddish means Jewish. And the only reason for the existence of the Yiddish language is to perpetuate the Jewish people and its Jewishness. Otherwise, why would you need a separate language? So, you know, Yiddish is the repository of Judaism. And it was certainly that for Sutskver. You can feel that in his poetry. And he was so happy coming to Eretz Yisrael, where he could participate in, you know, in the growth of Israel. It's complicated because when you come to Israel in 1947, there is a language war going on in the country. And of course he would have become aware of that. He knew it even beforehand, because in order to prepare for the independence of a Jewish state, what you had to have is you had to have a Jewish language. You had to have a national language. It's not just Ben Gurion who felt that. It's not just, you know, people running the country who felt that. I think spontaneously, the Jews who came to Eretz Yisrael must have felt that. It goes without saying that if you were going to gather in the Jews from all over the world, and you were going to reclaim a Jewish homeland, you had to have the language that united the Jews in space and in time. The only language that did that was the Hebrew language. So it was inevitable that you would have had to reclaim it as the spoken language, as the national language, as the vernacular of this people. But think of it, most of the Jews in the world in 1939 spoke Yiddish. And most of the Jewish writers in the world and creative artists in the world in 1939 were in Yiddish, no matter where they were. They were still the majority. So for the Yiddish poets and writers, whose whole investment was in the Yiddish language, to think of Eretz Yisrael having to, you know, squelch Yiddish in order to make Hebrew preeminent, it was unbelievably painful. And it was for them the most painful, because, let me put it this way, if you're a doctor and your language is Yiddish, it's true, you might have a hard time learning the Hebrew vocabulary and everything else, but the medicine is the same. If you're a shoemaker, you can make shoes in any language. If you're a poet and a writer, and this is your language, this is your instrument. You cannot change it. So for them, it was really like a extinction of a different kind. So there's no way of minimizing the pain that Yiddish writers felt, including Sutzkever to some extent. But look at his reaction compared to the reaction of others. He comes to Eretz Yisrael, and immediately, the first thing he does when he comes, he goes to the Histadrut. It is the incorporation practically of the government. And he insists on establishing a Yiddish literary journal in Tel Aviv. And within a year and a half, he's done it through the help of Zalman Shazar, through the help of friends that he had, but there's nobody was going to stand in his way. So if there was a state of Israel being born that had a strong will and strong people who said Ivrit, Ivrit, Hebrew, Hebrew, you know, and outlawed Yiddish usage, they had someone even stronger. And that was Sutzkever, who came, and no one would have stopped him from doing this. And he created in Tel Aviv the best literary journal that the Yiddish language ever had, one of the longest sustaining journals, and it became the central address for Yiddish creativity in all the world. You know, Sutzkever spent 2 years in Paris, basically from not 2 years actually, 1946, 1947. And there he met Chagall, and he found Paris very exciting. And of course, he immediately began to become more acquainted with French poetry, which he had known something about in Polish translation, but there he actually met Yiddish poets who were translating French poetry into Yiddish. And so he became much more acquainted with the French poetic tradition and French poetry. Now, the prose poem is a form which is very known and exploited in French poetry, especially Rimbaud, you know, is the great master of prose poetry. Now, what is the prose poem for somebody like Rimbaud? So I think for the French poets, it was finding a form which is a hybrid form, therefore very daring, because you're taking two things which are opposites and you are actually combining them and trying to make them one. So it's a very revolutionary form. But for them, the idea, I think, was to make things, to make the ordinary extraordinary, right? To use nightmare imagery, to mix realism with supernatural. And the prose poem was a form of breaking all these boundaries. See, Sutzkever comes to this form, also spontaneously looking for a form with which to describe what he has to say. But for him, I think it's just the opposite. He has to take the unbelievable and find a form of making it believable, right? So he takes the prose poem, but what he is doing is taking things which are unimaginable. How could there be the time of slaughter? I mean, how could you take this population of Jews and put it into a ghetto and within such a short period of time wipe them out? How could you have these scenes that he saw? You know, they're impossible. So for him, the form is a way of finding a prose form to convey an image which is really unimaginable. So you see, the prose poems for him are these episodes which are, you know, for example, you're going through the forest and you see a dry tree, a tree which is dry. That's a gift, because if you knock it down, you have firewood. And that's exactly what you're looking for, a dead tree. So you take the axe and you think that you're going to, but just at that moment, you hear a voice coming out of the tree. So you stop. And what do you find? That a Jew has hidden in this tree, and he is saying his prayers, he is davening inside the tree, And if he hadn't been davening at that particular point, the axe would have killed him, right? I mean, how amazing is that? So what is that? A coincidence? What is that? A moment of prayer? A moment of, godliness in this scene? You see, it brings home to you the absurdity of this situation. As I say, the impossibility of this situation. But in this prose poem, what you have at the end is this Jew who emerges from this dead tree in his talit, and there he is, having prayed. So they are all the 15 prose poems that actually tell you what was happening from the days of the ghetto till afterwards in the forest, until the city has been, reclaimed. It actually follows through the whole process through time. Each little episode is an episode which kind of really memorializes or I would use the word eternalizes these fleeting episodes and invites you to think more deeply about these events, not just as historical events, but to really, understand, the impossibility of the possible. Jews had survived the impossible. And how can you write about it as if it was ordinary? I mean, so the same man who bears witness in terms which are everyday and factual and tell you date and time and event also has to recreate for you some sense of extraordinariness, of miraculousness, you see. And the sense of the miraculous can only come through the writing, right? So he creates this form of a kind of, supernatural writing. I use this to say that Sutzkever is the antithesis of Adorno. Adorno's essay, you see, is a Marxist essay. It's not just a sentence. The sentence comes at the end of an essay. And it's really a very, he was a Marxist of a kind. And in any case, he's a materialist. And so he's writing this from a materialist point of view, And so he later refined this statement. But what he really means is, you see, that it's impossible to write poetry after Auschwitz. We understand what he has in mind. But you see, for Sutzkever, it was just exactly the opposite, that the only thing that can withstand Auschwitz is something that works by a different standard. If you just work by the standard of moral language as we formerly knew it, who can write? Who can use, for example, the German language, which was the language of Schiller and of Goethe? To use this language now that has been used by Hitler and by Sieg Heil and by all this, corruption of it. How after that, what are you going to write in that language? Hasn't language itself been corrupted? Firstly, Yiddish, you see, is safe. Yiddish is not German. I don't know, he doesn't make very much of that, but to me, Yiddish scholars could have made more of that. Just a side notice, when I got to Harvard for my interview, when I was meeting colleagues there to see whether I would take the job, whether they would offer me the job and so forth, there was a German scholar in my department who said very kindly, "Isn't Yiddish a corrupted form of German?" And I said to him, "No, actually German is a corrupted form of Yiddish." And so everybody laughed, but I was not laughing. I was not laughing because in a way, you see, after the war, Yiddish does not have to apologize for itself. for the way it functions, for what it stands for in history, and so forth. And I think Sutzkever, who is such a master of Yiddish, we haven't spoken about that, but his, the language is, I don't know how many people ever studied Yiddish as much as he did. He studied Old Yiddish. He wrote poems in Old Yiddish before the war, right? When he would talk to you, one of the things that he would delight in doing and laugh and have a wonderful time doing is if he remembered some saying that his grandmother used, or some saying that some Vilna, street woman used, and so forth. He loved this language. Well, my relationship with Sutzkever was probably the best kind of relationship that one could possibly have. I was 21 years old when I met him. He was 44. I was just married, and I had just finished college. I had not yet started my first job. And I knew quite a bit about Yiddish literature and Yiddish writing. But here was by far the most engaging and most impressive Yiddish writer I had ever met. I knew, many of my teachers in Montreal had been Yiddish poets and writers. Melech Ravitch was my teacher. I had met Itzik Manger at one point. I had seen and heard a lot of Yiddish writers, and I knew Leonard Cohen. I knew other English poets and writers and so forth. I was studying literature. This was my field, right? But this man was like no one I had met. First of all, I guess that what struck me most was his strength of character, and also physical strength. He had a handshake like iron. If you looked at his hands, you would never have thought that these were the hands of a poet. He was very, very strong, and very strong-willed, and he felt that he could command, right? Now, he didn't do it in any cruel way or in any... you were very happy to fall in with his demands, because his demands were also interesting, and they were also, you wanted to be part of this world. So we met a couple of times over the summer, and then I went back to Montreal, and my first job that I got was working as the press officer of the Canadian Jewish Congress. At that point, I thought I would go into a branch of journalism. And the first job I got was putting out the publications of the Canadian Jewish Congress. Sutzkever wanted to come to North America, and he knew me. He could not get into the United States because he had gotten a Stalin Award, and somehow or other word of this had gotten to the American government, and so it was very difficult for them to get a visa for him to go to the United States. Canada was the closest thing, North America, close to the United States. Montreal is only 400 miles away from New York. So we had the idea that I would organize a speaking tour for him in Canada, and that's what I did. Through the Canadian Jewish Congress, I organized a tour, mostly in Montreal, but then he also went to Toronto and to Winnipeg. Well, when he came in 1959, and how to describe those evenings, those experiences? I had been at many public gatherings of all kinds. I certainly had never experienced anything like this, nor had anyone else there, because, for example, because he could not come to New York, Yiddish poets from New York came to Montreal for the evenings. Hundreds and hundreds of people filled the halls. We got the largest halls we could possibly get. And Sutzkever would get up in front of these audiences, and he would read his ghetto poems, and he would tell these stories. And he's a wonderful speaker. But as a speaker, he didn't speak in this private voice of his. He spoke like Mayakovsky. He spoke in that kind of Russian style. He felt that one had to overpower an audience. And did he ever? There were such dramatic evenings. So, of course, one was very much under the impression of this writer, this figure, this poet who had come out of history, and this person who was so interesting, who had so much to say and who had so much to impart, and who was so significant. He gave the whole community a sense of its historic significance by being there in our midst. You see, he was the connector between all these people who had come from Europe with the Europe that they had left. He was now the connector of all these people with the land of Israel, which was reclaimed. It was a remarkable role that he was playing, and he was the person who could embody this, and did. So, you know, for example, just to tell you about his power, one thing he said to me, I want to meet A.M. Klein. Now, A.M. Klein is one of Canada's best-known poets, who happens to be one of its great Jewish poets. By the way, he's a very great Jewish poet and writer, not known to Israelis, unfortunately, not known for much of the Jewish world, but he will live. A.M. Klein is a very important figure. And A.M. Klein was a big translator of Yiddish and Hebrew poetry. Sutzkever knew anyone who translated. He knew what Klein had translated. Even though he didn't speak English, he knew enough English, or he had learned enough English to know how Klein had translated various things, right? So he wanted to meet A.M. Klein. I said to him, I'm sorry, I can arrange anything for you, but I can't arrange a meeting with A.M. Klein because A.M. Klein is in a depression. And I had tried to get him to write things for me in the Congress Bulletin. It had not worked out. He said, call him up and tell him I want to see him and arrange it. So I called him up and I introduced myself and I say, I'm calling on behalf of Avraham Sutzkever, who's here. He would like to meet you. Of course, he says, of course. Come the day after tomorrow, and gives me his address, and we go. I couldn't believe it. Of course, I went with Sutzkever to this meeting with A.M. Klein. It was amazing. I'm so sorry I didn't keep every note about it. They spoke for over an hour and a half in Yiddish about poetry, about who one liked and who one didn't like. They spoke very, very intimately. And then Klein said, it was about to leave. We weren't served anything or anything. It was all in this living room of Klein's house. And then we were going to leave. And Klein said, I want to show you my study. And he took Sutzkever and me into his study, and we were there for a moment, and they talked about something else, and then we left. I felt, I had just been through, you can imagine, these two great, poets meeting and how wonderfully it had gone, and Klein didn't seem depressed, he seemed animated, everything was wonderful. At the end of the block, as we were walking to the bus, Sutzkever stopped. And he was as if he had fallen into a depression. He was very, very. He said, did you see that? Did you see the study? I said, yes. I couldn't understand what was the problem. He said, did you see the desk? There wasn't a shred of paper, nothing on the desk, an empty desk. He says, that means the writer is finished. And this story I once actually told to a student of mine who made a film about A.M. Klein. because everybody was trying to figure out what is the source of the depression of A.M. Klein. Was it this? Was it that? As if one can identify such things. But this is just to tell you about Sutzkever. First of all, the power to arrange this. I mean, I'm telling you, no one had been able to meet with A.M. Klein. I didn't make up that he was in a depression. I mean, this was what everybody knew, so nobody was touching him. Sutzkever wanted it, it was done. And then to see that, to identify with that. I thought everything had gone so well. I thought he would be buoyed up. But what he saw was the fellow writer who was, you know, yes, who was...
But try to share with me, I mean, you went to study Yiddish, something that you didn't sing beforehand.
Yeah. Well, so that, there is a moment that I, you know, that looms very large for me, and I have written about it before, and it is a true moment. So at one point when Sutzkever was in Montreal and I was taking him from one place to the other, we became very good friends, and he said to me, so what are you going to do? And implying that, of course, I would not be working the rest of my life as the press officer of the Canadian Jewish Congress. And of course, I shared this view completely, thinking, of course, I was not going to. So I said, well, you know, I've been thinking of going back to school, and what are you going to study, he said. And I said, well, I'm going to study English literature, which is what I had been studying. And he said, why don't you study Yiddish literature? I started to laugh. And I said, and what would I do, teach Shalom Aleichem? And as those words came out of my mouth, first of all, he was terribly insulted, but he didn't have to be insulted. As I spoke the words, I thought to myself, what is this? Who is this person? You see, it was such a shock, because I had studied Shalom Aleichem. I knew about the power of Yiddish literature and Yiddish poetry. This is what I had grown up with. It's not a stranger to me. But I had been to college, and in all of college when I went, there wasn't, the word Jew was not mentioned. There was at that time not a single Jewish studies course, not Hebrew, nothing. And even in courses where you would think that it was inevitable to talk about the Jew was never mentioned. So it had never occurred to me, simply, you know, it never occurred to me to put these two things together, college and Yiddish. It seemed preposterous, so I laughed. And then the next day, of course, Sutzkever immediately knew where one could study Yiddish. And in a sense, I discovered only years later, that this was a kind of ambush, that he had spoken to Max Weinreich, who knew about the program in New York, that they were looking for students, that Sutzkever knew that, you know, I could very well be persuaded to study. So this was entirely a kind of ambush, but of course I didn't recognize that, nor did I care afterwards that it was an ambush or not. The next day, he told me, I called Uriel Weinreich at Columbia University. I said, look, I think I'd like to come and study Yiddish literature. He said, sure, we can arrange for a scholarship for you. And the next January, I started, in the middle of term, I started in the January term, studying Yiddish literature. I've not regretted it.